give you all credit, especially for when we, like say, did the grading in class, which admittedly was not just about, having you essentially do my grading for me, but it was also kind of a mini quasi experiment to see how honest you all would be. It actually made it for a lot more work for me now that I think about it, because I had to go and recheck all of your answers. But like I said before, I was quite impressed that most all of you were actually more critical on yourselves than I would have been. So most of you actually got grades higher than what you told me. And I think that shows to at least somewhat of a good character there. I don't like Course Hero at all or any of those other ones. And it really puts me at a bit of a moral dilemma here, because legitimately, I root for every single one of you. I mean, if you think about it, if you all get A's, how much easier is that on my life, kind of thing? I don't like to, bust out the red ink just for the sake of doing it. It just makes my life more difficult. So if you think about it, I understand, like I can completely conceptualize and get why people cheat. But at the same time, you're not learning anything from it. So especially when it's like foundational information, there's going to be really no way that you're going to be able to apply that if you just essentially cheat and don't learn the material. But that's kind of my ramblings for the day there. Like I said, no one in here, which is always nice, but just thought I would pass that message along. And definitely, if you create a Course Hero account, I've never understood this, but why would you upload materials to that are like, blatantly helping with academic dishonesty, and then attach your actual name to it? Like, for shits and giggles, I searched my name on there, and I found one of my ex-phys courses I taught over the summer, and all of my quizzes and my final exam were on there. And the dude put his name on it. Like, are you kidding me? You're really going to post a final exam and put your name on it as though that's not going to somehow come back and haunt you? What's super shitty about that situation was this dude actually had me write a letter of recommendation for him. And now that puts me in a tough spot, because I recommended a kid that I now found out cheated his way through the whole course. And granted, well, I guess I shouldn't say that he cheated, because I can't prove that from him just uploading the quizzes and tests. But he's still contributing to academic dishonesty by posting the quizzes and tests. So what do I do? Do I go be vindictive, contact his graduate school and say, hey, guess what? Broski isn't who either of us thought he was? But yeah, that's more of my moral dilemma there. But again, big thing, just don't cheat. Okay, let's see here. The exam went quite well. So average grade was around about an 80%. So yeah, I was quite pleased with most everyone's performance there. I still have one person that needs to take it, so I won't really be able to go over it until probably next week. But yeah, that was definitely pleasantly surprising to see how well everyone did. Yeah, any questions on the exam though? One of the definitely the shortcomings with doing anything online where you have to write out an answer is that a computer isn't always able to read and interpret an answer one way that it shouldn't. So like, for example, in the question where you had to put power and joules or power and work, there's virtually no way you could have answered it unless you copied my exact text to get that answer correct, which is why I threw a little note in there that if you got it right, I was going to change it. I've had systems before where if you like write out a phone number with dashes versus no dashes, it doesn't recognize it as the same phone number kind of thing. So makes those kind of difficult. But yeah, like I said, rather pleased with how everyone did. Okay, so today we are getting into the wrist and the hand. Now, one thing I want to really just point out real quick here is here we go, is if you notice, this is your, this is from our lecture, this is from lab. You'll notice that the numbers here for normal ranges of motion aren't quite the same. So you look at, let's say, pronation, lab has 85 to 90 degrees, and the lecture has 70. Radial deviation 20, 15 to 25, ulnar deviation 30, 25 to 40. So depending on the source you use, you're going to see differences in these. What I want to see is that it's essentially like in the ballpark. So, for example, this says the wrist extension's 85 degrees, wrist flexion's 85, 70 to 90, 65 to 85. I mean, as long as you're in that range, I'm okay. If you said like wrist extension's 50, then okay, that's probably not gonna fly. But just so you're aware, you're gonna see different ranges of motions based on really what source you use. It's kind of like, I don't know why the immediate thing that comes to mind is like when you should go to the hospital while in labor, when contractions are roughly 5 to 7 minutes apart and or 6 minutes apart kind of thing. Different, but really not. So just kind of keep that in mind. Ooh. You do have all right, so you do have this term paper that we're going to do, but it's not for quite some time. So I didn't move this, but whatever, that's okay. So if you read about the term paper, it's the one that's due like in week 13. So don't worry so much about it right now. We'll go over that a little bit later. All right, so there's a lot of stuff with the wrist and hand. Tons of bones, countless ligaments and soft tissues. So we're going to focus on the stuff that is grossly important to us. Some of the other things will be important to you depending on, like, say, your career path. Like if you wanted to be an occupational or like say a hand therapist, then definitely knowing, like, say, all the intrinsic muscles of the wrist and hand and the fingers are absolutely pertinent to you. For virtually everyone else, not so much. I mean, even when you do, like, say, a biomechanical analysis of whatever, of any part of the wrist and hand, none of your really intrinsic muscles are all that important to it. Now, when you talk about, like, say, fine motor skills and stuff like that and being able to manipulate objects, absolutely, that stuff's all really important. But for our purposes of knowing function and movement, not so much. So I'll make sure to highlight everything you do need to know. And pretty much if I don't say you need to know it, you can assume you don't need to know it. Now, what kind of mnemonic are you all using these days for the carpal bones?
Sally likes to push the toy car hard. That's the one I've always known.
Okay. That is definitely very PG there.
Do you use a gross one?
Yeah. Some lovers try positions that they can't handle. Anyone else ever heard anything else? What have you heard? Oh, I know there's at least one other. I can't think of what it was, but it was someone a couple years ago that told me here. So yeah, whatever mnemonic you use, it only works when you look at the anterior version or anterior positioning of the wrist and hand. So for this here, they're showing the left palmar view. So left hand up like that. This here is your thumb. This is your pinky, meaning this is going to be your radius. This is going to be your ulna. So you got two rows of four bones that are going to make up all your carpal bones. And if you look at your wrist, you should have a nice little crease right at the base of your palm. So that very first crease you see from where your palm actually starts going into your wrist, that is where your first row of bones are, or your distal row of carpal bones are. Underneath that, or directly below that, is going to be your proximal carpal bones. So this little notch you have on your pinky side wrist, well, there's actually a ligament that runs over that, so you can actually feel that ligament if you just kind of roll it over. But the bone underneath it is going to be your pisiform bone. If you go from your fifth metacarpal bone and go straight down until you feel kind of a drop in, that is really where you're going to feel the hamate bone. So it kind of goes right into where that crease is. So anyways, if we start proximally and go thumb side to pinky side, you got your scaphoid, lunate, triquetrum, and then your pisiform on the side here. Right above that pisiform, you'll feel the hamate. And then if I go from pinky to thumb, then from there, hamate, and then capitate, trapezium, trapezoid, trapezium, there we go. So the trapezoid you would actually feel if you go straight down the thumb, and then once you hit the base of the thumb, you'll feel a little bump coming out. That's really where your trapezium is. For the most part, you don't have a lot of movement around the carpal bones. The only real, I guess, movement we want to be so concerned about is really at the proximal row there, which actually makes up more of that condyloid joint that you have. Or I'm sorry, condyloid, ellipsoid. All right, so the major joint you have that actually makes up the wrist is your radiocarpal joint. So if we look back here, again, this is radius, this is ulna. And you see how the radius on the distal end is really what makes up the majority of your wrist, or the wrist joint itself. The ulna is much smaller at the distal end, and it really doesn't connect with anything. I mean, yeah, it kind of sits on the outer edge of the lunate, but for the most part, all it's doing is adding an extra place for support. And if you remember too, the ulna doesn't move, so it stays stationary. When it's stationary, that means it's much easier to act as an anchor point than it is to act as a movement locale. So your radius is the bone that's primarily going to make up all the movement with the wrist itself. So again, this radiocarpal joint, that's your wrist joint proper. And have you all done the wrist in lab yet? Okay, good. Your CMC joint, your carpometacarpal joint, this only exists for your thumb. Well, I shouldn't technically say that, but you do have these joints throughout all your metacarpals. However, the thumb's the only one that moves. Everything else is stationary, because you can't or shouldn't be able to move your metacarpal bones. I don't know how many of you can like fold your palm in on itself, which I hope you can't. Otherwise, that'd be impressive and or terribly disturbing. But your thumb, you can move. So the wrist itself is ellipsoid, which essentially makes it kind of a modified hinge joint. Your thumb is what kind of joint? Saddle joint, yeah. Your thumb acts as like a joystick. So if you ever think of like, say, your whatever PlayStation, name any other video game console controller that has the joysticks, that's how your thumb works. While you can essentially circumduct it, you have no rotational ability to it. Maybe think about it. If you take a joystick, can you rotate that joystick? No, it stays stationary. Same thing with your wrist itself. While you can kind of circumduct your wrist, there's no rotational movement that it has. So your thumb and your wrist do not have transverse plane movements. The transverse plane movement that is pronation supination is considered a forearm movement or an elbow movement. So the wrist itself only does four things. It does flexion, extension, radial, and ulnar deviation. There's no ab and adduction. Radial deviation means I move towards my radius in the frontal plane. Ulnar deviation, I move towards the ulna in the frontal plane. You can't rotate your wrist. We'll talk about the thumb movements specifically a little bit later, but thumb has a lot more movements, but they're odd in terms of what the positioning actually is. Don't worry about the really the cartilage around here. It does exist. This is kind of what holds together your distal radial ulnar joint. And it does help to provide more really cushion between the radius and ulna and your carpal bones. The only major thing that is noteworthy about this is how much this is vascularized. So typically cartilage has little to no vascular support to it. Your wrist is one of the exceptions to that. And essentially it just means that this is going to be able to last a little bit longer than most all of your other cartilage. All right, your intercarpal joints, we don't really care so much about those. All these do are adding additional stability. All right, the carpometacarpal bone, your thumb. Like I said, I'll talk about that in a little bit. The carpometacarpal bones aren't doing a whole heck of a lot. They have some movement, but really they're, like I said, they're really not all that useful. Yeah, so I'm not so worried that you know all about those. What I'm much more concerned about is that you know these ones. So the joints in your fingers, so fingers are phalanges or digits. You have your fingers labeled in terms of their number. So your thumb is usually labeled digit 1, and then index is 2, pinky's 5. So you would refer to whatever hand you're talking about and then the number of the digit to give it its anatomical name. So like my left hand 5th digit, I'm talking about my pinky kind of thing. All right. The 3 joints you have are really the 3 sets of knuckles you have. You have the most control over these as they start going proximally. So if they're going back towards the, or the closer I should say they are to the wrist, the more control you have over them. The more distal they are, the closer your fingertips, the less control you have over them. Your MCP joint is your metacarpal phalangeal joint. So joint between your metacarpals and your phalanges. Your hip and dip joints, proximal and distal interphalangeal joint. And I never really got why it's inter, not intra, because like inter makes it sound like it's a joint with like a different finger. But anyways, proximal is your second knuckle, distal is your last or your third knuckle. So when you're referring to the wrist and hand, proximal is towards the wrist, distal is towards your fingertips. If we're talking about the forearm, proximal is towards the elbow, distal is towards the wrist. You have the most movement ability with the MCP joint. So the MCP joint, you can do true flexion extension, and then you have ab and adduction with it. Now, what's a little bit noteworthy with ab and adduction of the MCP joint is that midline is the center of your hand or your middle finger. So if you're abducting, you're going away from midline. So I mean, I guess if you took your middle finger and tried to move it side to side, you would technically be abducting it either way you went. Although I don't know how often you're actually doing that with the middle finger. For the most part, you know, index finger is the one that has the most movement out of all of them. But again, with these, you can do a kind of modified, you know, circumduction with that. But the movements you have: flexion, extension, ab, adduction. Your pip joint is a true hinge joint, and your dip joint are true hinge joints. So these are flexion, extension. you can really only passively move your pip and dip joints and anything out of the sagittal plane. So yeah, like I can twist my knuckle, I can bend it side to side, but you can't actively do that. If you can, you're really impressive though. The dip joint is the most difficult to isolate. It's very difficult to actually move this on its own. The only way you can really move this, I mean, like I can do like kind of something like that with my fingers, but you have to isolate the dip joint by essentially holding off or cutting off your pip joint movement, so then the dip will actually be able to move. So while the dip joint will move when you flex your pip joint, it's very difficult also to flex the pip joint without moving the dip joint, but you get those to move at the same time. The only way, well, I shouldn't say the only way, but the easiest way to move your dip joint in isolation is if you stabilize or secure your pip joint so that then you can move that dip on its own. And if you think about it, you usually don't have a whole lot of need to use one like pip or dip without the other. I mean, if you're picking up something, you know, you're picking it up, you have to virtually flex both ends of it. Really, all your fine motor skills are going to involve movement of both the pip and the dip. So while you can isolate them, it's not really functional to do so. Now, one of the things too to keep in mind, and this is true of both really the hand and the foot, is the individual control you have over your digits. So it's much easier to see like in the foot, but how many of you can move your toes independently of each other? I mean, I can maybe move my pinky toe kind of on its own, but everything else you have some sort of movement with it. You have less restriction in the hand, but you still have some. So for example, try to make a, you know, put up 4 fingers, like your thumb and your first 3 fingers, and how easy is that to do? Like what does your pinky want to do? Well, try it. What's going on with your pinky when you do that? Yeah, it wants to join the party, right? And it can't. But now try to keep this pinky completely down and move these up. I mean, you can't even do it passively. So bend it at the MCP joint all the way down, and then try to open that hand up. Even if you do it passively, you can't do it. And that's all because that you're sharing a lot of common tendons here. Essentially, they're not separating each other until they get to the fingers. The muscles that control them are in the forearm. So when you have a muscle that's controlling it in the forearm, and you don't actually separate until much farther down the line, it's very hard to get independent movement out of that. Now, like I said, yeah, everyone can move their fingers independently of each other, but there's a lot more restriction to it when you try to put them into, you know, specific patterns. Your thumb doesn't really have anything to do with it. So your thumb is independent of your fingers. So I can move my thumb regardless of where my finger positioning is. I can move my fingers regardless of where my thumb positioning is. So that's the main one that doesn't really do it there. And again, that's because that carpometacarpal joint you have, so you can kind of see it, like if you move your thumb around, where you have that nice kind of muscular pad in your palm for the thumb, that's really where the movement is of that carpometacarpal joint. So your thumb has a lot more independence because its first movement occurs right after the wrist. as opposed to after the metacarpal bones. Does that kind of make sense? So pretty much the more kind of traffic you have, the less independent movement you have. If you're in a traffic jam, you are only moving as fast as the car in front of you, kind of thing. All right, so MCP joint's a condyloid joint. So this gives us that ability to ab and adduct. A condyloid joint has how many degrees of freedom? 2, yes. I can go flexion extension, ab adduction, 2 degrees of freedom. All of your wrist and finger joint movements are going to be greatest in flexion. They'll be less, for the most part, in extension. You also have much stronger wrist and hand flexors than you do extensors. Some of this has to do with location. Others have to do with the really joint structure itself. But yeah, in general, flexion is the position of deformity. So if you think about, like, curling up in the fetal position, your body is essentially completely in flexion. So flexion is where your body wants to default to. Generally speaking, flexion is going to be stronger than extension in most all cases. There's only a few different ones that are, actually, you would actually see that the extension is stronger. So, like, for example, like your knee and elbow extensors are stronger than your knee and elbow flexors. That's kind of like the only example I can think of, though. All right, hinge joints for the pip and dip joints. So again, these are only working in flexion extension. For the most part, extension for your hip and dip joint should be at 0. I mean, I can take my index finger here on my left hand and I can go into hyperextension with the pip joint, so I can actually get that to come out. So this would actually be considered negative extension. It's actually kind of a lot. That's probably close to 20-ish degrees there. But for the most part, you should be able to keep your finger straight. I don't know anyone that can do hyperextension with the dip joint. Can any of you do that? Yeah, that one's real tough. The problem with the dip joint is that you have actually more bony connections there, making it much more difficult to do. And you're also obviously the very distal end, meaning you have the least amount of force production attached to it. All these joints are synovial joints. So what is a synovial joint?
It's a diarthrosis and it has lots of range of motion.
That is all true. All synovial joints have to move. They all also have a capsule containing synovial fluid. So when you say crack a joint or crack your knuckles or whatever, that sound you hear is just carbon dioxide that is dissolved in your synovial fluid escaping. So that's all of that sound is. You can't give yourself arthritis from say cracking your bones or whatnot. Yeah. one of the things that we haven't talked a whole heck of a lot about is different injuries to, like, different specific injuries to your joints. Some of your joints are pretty much completely protected, others not so much. Your fingers, for the most part, really shouldn't get hurt unless they have some sort of trauma really acting on them. For the most part, you're going to hurt a finger if it gets struck like head on or on the tip of it. You know, while, like, okay, they showed the example here of the getting hit with the basketball. Very possible. Catching anything can definitely cause that. So basketball players, football players, much more common for that to happen since they're actually physically catching with their hands. In baseball, or softball, the major way you're going to hurt a finger is through sliding, especially sliding head first. I've actually seen, like, I actually coached a kid who slid head first into third base, and I still actually don't know how it exactly happened, but his ring finger on, I think it was his left hand, hit the base first, and it dislocated the MCP joint and it popped out. Your bones, by the way, are pearly white. So if you have a bone that sticks out, like, that thing is like the whitest, brand new, shiny thing you'll ever see, kind of thing. And what was funny, he was like all pumped up about, like, oh, I got like a triple or something like that. And then as soon as he saw his hand, it's like you could just, like, in slow motion see, like, life just end for him, kind of thing. Surprisingly, there's very little blood there too, which was kind of weird to me, to see the whole bone pop out of the skin and not really too much blood. I know this is definitely the stuff you want to be talking about at 7:30 in the morning, but after he immediately left the game, he made it all the way to the parking lot before we heard the shrill of pain and horror come out. So that adrenaline probably lasted a solid 5-10 minutes there. The thumb is much more susceptible to injury because it has much more use. While you can, like, say, stub your thumb, most likely what happens with injuring your thumb is that it gets caught on something and you yank it. So the term you may hear is gamekeeper's thumb. This will happen if, like, say, your thumb gets caught on something, but your hand or body keeps going. A lot of times, like, you may get caught on, like, say, someone's jersey, something like that. So what happens in soccer somewhat frequently, that can injure that. What's particularly difficult about finger injuries is the anatomy surrounding them. So finger or thumb injuries is the overall anatomy you have. Because everything's so small and compact, it takes a relatively long time to heal. And because you don't have really the same kind of architecture in there that would usually allow for, like, a surgical repair, it's very difficult to have a surgery on a finger or your thumb unless you have something really bad happen. So for the most part, these are kind of, anytime you injure any of your fingers or your thumb, it's usually more of a waiting game than anything. I remember one pitcher, gosh, it was probably now like 15 years ago. Like, so in the 2000s, when I was in college, I would go and stalk professional athletes for autographs and then sell them on eBay for money, kind of thing, because I didn't want to have, like, a real job at the time. And now, as I kind of think about it just now, like, most all of those, like, athletes, when they were, minor leaguers, rookie players, all that, they're, like, retiring now. I mean, they're, like, close to their 40s. Good Lord, what happened? Anyway, there was one guy for the Cleveland Indians organization. His name was Adam Miller, who is a pitcher for them. And I think he was their first round draft pick in like 2000 or 2001. So he was throwing around about like 97 to 99 miles an hour, nothing too terribly hard. And he injured his hip joint in his middle finger on his throwing hand. And he actually did it repeatedly. And to actually fix it, because virtually every time he was like rehabbing and then starting to throw again, he would essentially tear the ligaments surrounding it. They essentially anchored it. So his middle finger is like this now permanently. And you gotta think like that's if you're stuck like that, how much that can potentially interfere with most all your fine motor skills. But I guess when you're getting paid hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars to do something, usually there's some sort of give and take with it. But that was the only incident I've ever seen of someone injuring a finger without having an impact on it. So very rare that you see like an overuse type injury with your fingers. All right, now our thumb movements. Thumb does a whole lot of everything. So because it's a saddle joint, it can do everything except rotation. Now, with your thumb, what you're using as your essentially kind of midline point is your radius. And you're viewing it really from the position you have to be in to align it, like say with the other planes, is kind of tricky. So you would essentially be facing your arm outward if you were trying, or facing your palm outward if you were trying to align your thumb with the rest of your cardinal planes. And that's because when you do, like for example, abduction, you push your thumb away from your palm. So abduction is here, adduction you bring back. So there's your frontal plane movements that you have, which you don't think of that being frontal because it's like sagittal, we would normally think. Your flexion extension is going across and out. And then you have this opposition reposition. So opposition just means that you can touch your other fingers. And this means that you can touch your thumb to them. So don't touch your fingers to your thumb, but move your thumb to touch your fingers. Now, granted, they're going to move in concert with each other, but I think you get the idea there. Repositioning, adduction, that's all just going back to your high five position. So if you're calling somebody a loser, that's extension. You bring your thumb to your palm, that is flexion. Abduction, you point at somebody. Adduction, you're gonna give them a high five. So even though you have these 6 different movements with the thumb still only has 2 degrees of freedom. So because you can't rotate your thumb, you still are stuck with those 2 degrees of freedom. You have much more range of motion with it than say like your MCP joint, but still limited. All right, so there's all your bones. Any questions on those? All right, for the muscles, real simple. Muscles all tell you exactly what they're doing and where they are. So, term carpi refers to the wrist. Flexor, obviously flexor. And then radialis ulnaris refers to which bone it's going to attach to. All of your wrist flexors are anterior on your forearm from anatomical position. All of your wrist extensors are posterior from anatomical position. These are all going to move the wrist, not fingers and thumb. What's the key word I'm going to look for fingers?
Digitorum.
Digit of some form. And then thumb. Here we go. Do not confuse this with the big toe, which is hallucis or hallucis. So, flexor carpi radialis. Flexor, I'm going to flex the wrist and I'm going to move towards the radius, so moving towards thumb side. So, flexor carpi radialis does wrist flexion and it also does radial deviation. Flexor carpi ulnaris, same thing, wrist flexion, but now it does also ulnar deviation. And that's why when you do, like, say, your manual muscle test for these, if you're testing, say, flexor carpi radialis, person gets in wrist flexion and deviates towards the radius, you resist them into extension towards the ulna. So you're going at a 45-degree angle away from them. Palmaris longus, don't worry so much about that, but that just really does wrist flexion. And palmaris, or anything palmar, that's going to be anterior side of the forearm as well. Wrist extensors. So again, extensor, carpi, extends the wrist. Radialis goes into radial deviation. And then extensor carpi ulnaris, same thing, ulnar deviation. This means that your flexors and extensors are going to share a common motion, and that is your frontal plane movement of the wrist. So your, say, flexor carpi radialis and extensor carpi radialis are both going to contribute to radial deviation. And same thing with ulnaris. Now here, you see how much of all of these are going to attach at your elbow. So medial epicondyle of the elbow, what else? What other structures there we need to worry about? So where's your medial epicondyle? Yep, and what else is there other than a bunch of muscles?
The radial nerve somewhere around there.
Yeah, on the opposite side.
Oh, shoot. Ulnar nerve.
That is there. And what else? Your ulnar collateral ligament, very good. So your UCL is going to be in the mix here. And you notice that with having so much going on here, that it makes your elbow really kind of jam-packed in terms of everything that's there. Now, this side here for your wrist extensors, that's going to attach at your ulnar side, or I'm sorry, your radial side. So lateral elbow is where your wrist extensors are going to attach. And really, if you put your arm in supination and then you hold on to your elbow, if you extend the wrist, you'll feel towards thumb side that you get that contraction. If you flex it, you're going to get pinky side. So that's also partly why your UCL becomes so vulnerable, because if you think about it, especially throwing, at the end of throwing, you're into wrist flexion. So you have a terminal process that is going to cause more really strain on the medial elbow and in turn the UCL. Okay, for your hand, anything that says digit on it is going to refer to your fingers. Anything that says pollicis is going to be your thumb. The only major thing that kind of differentiates all these is just which joint or joints that it's going to affect. So every one of these, well, every digit muscle is going to impact your MCP joint. And then depending on the insertion point will be if it does dip and or pip. What I am most worried about is that you are able to get the general movement of it. Now, the deeper the muscle is, the typically more distal it will go. So for example, we look at flexor digitorum superficialis versus profundus. Superficialis is only going to impact your pip joint. It does not make it to the dip joint. Whereas profundus here inserts at the dip. All right, so I forget what the lab question is, but it's you hurt, whatever, a tennis player hurts their digit twos. I think it was flexor digitorum something. And what grips are they not able to do? What did you all put for that?
Precision, like pinchy grips.
Yeah. I've had students say that if you injured digit twos any of the flexor tendons in digit 2, that you wouldn't be able to move the wrist. And I've always wondered why the thought of that would be there. I mean, it's like kind of like saying, you know, if you break your wrist, that you can't move your elbow, kind of thing, which not really true at all. But yeah, wherever you have an injury, it's going to be, for the most part, localized to that. You can't go upstream. You can only go downstream. It's also kind of like if you have any kind of like nerve injury, everything above the injury site is still perfectly fine. It's everything downstream from it that gets affected. Okay. So again, all of your wrist and finger muscles are going to tell you which direction they go and really what they are going to impact. It's very easy because they all state that they are flexors or extensors in the name, so it makes that real easy. Anything that says digit refers to your fingers. Anything that says pollicis refers to your thumb. Anything that says carpi refers to the wrist. All right, our grips. 4 power grips, 3 precision grips. All your power grips are essentially going to be your gross motor skills. All of your precision grips are going to be fine motor skills. Pretty much the way you use a grip outside of the, you know, why you're doing it based on, like, say, the object you're trying to manipulate, all that's changing is the activation of certain muscles based on however the grip's position is. If you have a hook grip, the hook grip's exceptional because you're only using your fingers. So if I were, like, say, grabbing a bar, which I don't have, hook grip's going to be one where I'm essentially letting my thumb out. Why would you want to use a hook grip? You're using a hook grip to pick up something that you can't completely encapsulate. So meaning, if I'm picking up a box off the ground, can I get my thumb around the box? I mean, if you can, that's really impressive. I want to see that, you know, Mr. Fantastic happen there. But you use a hook grip because your thumb can't get around the box to secure it like you would if I were, say, grabbing like a phone or whatnot. My thumb can get all the way around to secure that. If I'm lifting a package, my thumb can't get over top of that package, kind of thing. So that's really where you're going to most likely see the hook grip occur. Cylindrical grip for cylindrical objects. So you're grabbing a bottle or something like that. The spherical grip and a fist grip are essentially the same thing. The only real difference is where your fingers and thumb meet. So typically for a cylindrical or a spherical grip, you're not going to touch the thumb and fingers together. For a fist grip, you will. So if you had any of your bottles here that were much thinner and you were able to grab completely around them and touch your thumb to your fingers while doing it, that now is a fist grip. Cylindrical or spherical is when you have separation. So thumb can't touch your fingers and be a cylindrical or a spherical grip. That kind of makes sense? And then our precision grips, all these here are how we are manipulating an object with our fine motor skills. And primarily it's going to be the interaction between our thumb and our index finger. When we have the, say, 3-prong chuck, that's going to use your middle finger. For the most part, your pinky and your ring finger are kind of useless. Your ring finger especially has virtually no application for it. You need a pinky to act as, like, say, a kind of a foundational counterbalance kind of thing. So for example, if you were trying to throw a football, next time you throw a football, if you ever do, try throwing it without a pinky and see how well that goes. Virtually everything, if you lose your ring finger and you're not engaged and or married, it's kind of useless. So if you're ever asked, you have to give up a finger right now, without question, it should be your ring finger. No function to it. I mean, yes, it does serve functional purposes, but in the grand scheme of things, these 4 are the ones that are much more important. Side note, so I got a like free little life insurance policy from my credit union where I have my car loan. So just for being a member, I get a whole $2,000 life insurance policy, and I can actually cash it in even if I don't die. So I just have to lose 2 of the following: eye, limb, hand, finger, foot, and or leg. So if I just lose 2 of the following, I get $2 grand. So, hey. And if I go, if I lose a part of my thumb, I get half of it. So, never know. All right. The 2 that tend to confuse people the most are the lateral pinch and tip to tip. And this is just where your contact is important. 3-prong chuck's the easiest because, 3, you got 3 fingers, the claw kind of thing. The 3-prong chuck is your most useful. Most of your fine motor skills are going to involve using that or some derivative thereof. The lateral pinch, you don't see a whole heck of a lot. The picking up the car keys bit or using car keys, yeah. I could see, like, say, texting, perhaps, being a lateral pinch. But lateral pinch is just where you have the pad of your thumb touching the side of a finger, typically your index finger. I don't know how many of you are picking up things like between your ring finger or middle finger and your thumb kind of thing. And then your tip to tip is just your essentially pad to pad. So your pad of your thumb meets pad of your index finger. The only thing with a tip to tip pinch that you don't consider is having fingernails. So the classic example of a tip to tip pinch is picking up, like, say, a coin from the table or the ground. How easy is it to do that if you don't have fingernails, though? It kind of makes it relatively difficult to do. Kind of same thing, like if you open up a pop tab, you are technically doing a tip to tip pinch, but it's kind of difficult to do that without a nail, just for getting that initial grip on it. But moral of the story is that your precision grips are fine motor skills, your power grips are gross motor skills. And as the names kind of imply, you can use a lot more force with the power grip than you can with the precision grip. Now, one other thing I wanted to note here with your with the power grips especially is how this can affect, like, say, exercise. So if I'm not using my thumb, I'm requiring much more work out of really my forearm flexors, or my forearm muscles for that matter. If I do any bar-based exercises, and typically it only works if you have a bilateral grip going, meaning you have two hands on a bar, I can really change a lot of the synergistic focus of the exercise based on the position of my thumb. So for example, like, say I'm doing like a lat pull down. You do a lat pull down, you hold onto the bar and you pull it down. Great. Well, if I just take my thumb and put it over top of the bar, so I go into a hook grip, now I not only get my lats and my biceps working, but now I get a lot of my wrist flexors working. And you'll feel a lot of really tension leave the side of your forearm and go onto the anterior portion of your forearm when you do that. So changing thumb position can go a long way with developing your forearm muscles a lot better than just, say, doing a strict forearm exercise, like, say, doing like a wrist curl, wrist extension, that kind of thing. It's just kind of one of those ways you can kill two stones with one bird. Ooh, I don't know how appropriate this is anymore. Sorry, Dan. All right, opposition is just what separates us and other primates from the rest of the animal kingdom. Having a hand is great and all, but if you weren't able to have any opposition, it would be very difficult to manipulate anything. So gross motor skills wouldn't really be affected, but fine motor skills definitely would. You have arches of your hand the same that you have arches of your feet. They're not as important with the hand because your hand's non-weight bearing. I mean, I guess if you're walking on your hands all day, it would be important. But since I don't think any of you are, they're really not. So you have, like I said, these same arches that act on your metacarpal bones, the same as we'll see when we do the foot, when we'll talk about the arches that are on your metatarsal bones. And they all are going to add really support and stability for really the palm itself. But it's not so important for the hand. It's good and all, but if you didn't have them, you really wouldn't notice. Whereas if you have fallen arches in your foot or you have flat feet, you definitely will notice that. And it's all just based on weight bearing status. Like I said, if your hands were weight bearing, then yeah, you would definitely notice it if you didn't have them. But since they're not so important. Okay, this here is the carpal tunnel. So with the carpal tunnel, you see we got 10 things all jammed into there. Here's your carpal bones. So the carpal tunnel is going to be located essentially anteriorly to the carpal bones and really in the middle, or kind of bisecting your forearm. And if you really look at your wrist, so your wrist should be roughly the circumference of your middle finger to your thumb. So that's about what your wrist size is. Much smaller when you do it that way, kind of, than when you actually see it. So 10 things fit into about a dime size space right in the middle of that. A little bit bigger, but very, very small space. When you actually can visualize that, that is really what should give you a better understanding of how, like, say, that active insufficiency works. Because you have that very small amount of space carrying a whole bunch of stuff. And if that gets cut off, it makes it so everything distal to that is going to not work nearly as efficiently. When you talk about the carpal tunnel, though, you most likely associate it with carpal tunnel syndrome. And that's where you have inflammation in one or more various parts of this, and essentially makes it kind of like a domino effect. Who are the people that are going to have carpal tunnel syndrome issues or a higher risk for that?
People with desk jobs.
All right, more specifically, people that are typing a lot. Yeah, that'll work. There's one other major category.
Are you talking about career-wise?
Yeah.
Pianist?
Maybe. I mean, I don't know how many, concert pianists we have in the world. So yeah, I could definitely see that though. The only real problem with that is to play piano, you usually have very little wrist movement. So you're not going to the extremes with it. That's why it's a little easier on there. Primarily, you're going to look at, like, say, your manual laborers, people especially that are swinging hammers around quite frequently or using any kind of hand tools. Those are the ones that are going to be most effective. Because now, once you add force on top of small space, very easily you get problems. Something like, having carpal tunnel syndrome isn't going to, kill you. It's going to be annoying though. The major problem with it is to get any kind of inflammation to dissipate from an area, you typically need to quit using it. I mean, if you got, let's say, if you're a baseball player and then you had shoulder tendonitis, would you go and keep throwing like nothing happened? No, you wouldn't throw for a period of time while that heals. I mean, yeah, you still probably do exercises and whatnot to help rehab that, but you're not going to go out and keep throwing when you have inflammation in your shoulder, because can only make it worse. Well, how many of you can, say, immobilize your wrist for a prolonged period of time? I mean, you think about it, holding your wrist in slight extension. Could you do this all day and keep it here? I mean, very, very difficult to do so. If you ever look at a carpal tunnel brace, it'll be a wrist brace that holds you into slight extension. When you go into extension, and you can see if you look at your thumb, so if you do like this and look at your thumb, and then you go into flexion, you'll, even slight flexion, you'll see how the wrist itself starts narrowing. If you go into extension, you see how it kind of opens up. You do that slight extension or wrist extension, and that's going to give a more overall space being available to the carpal tunnel. So it helps to allow for those affected areas to, those inflamed areas to kind of go down. But usually you got to keep that on or keep it there for 8 to 12 hours a day kind of thing, which makes it a little bit difficult to do. What is most important here with the carpal tunnel is this guy right here, your median nerve. So you have your axillary nerve coming off of your shoulder down through your bicep. That splits into three when you get to the elbow. So you have your ulnar nerve, your radial nerve, and your median nerve. Those three go down. The ulnar nerve and the radial nerve stay out of the carpal tunnel. They go outside of your carpal bones, so you really don't have to worry about them so much. Your median nerve goes straight through it though. That's the thing that gets the most amount of problem attached to it. Because when you have any kind of nerve impingement or nerve injury, that's where you're going to actually feel the effects. And if you notice where the median nerve actually is, this here is at the bottom, or that's probably the easiest way just to term it, of the carpal tunnel. So everything really above it pushes on it. So pretty much every time you do any kind of wrist flexion motion, or you're doing even any kind of, say, ulnar deviation, you're going to put more tension on that median nerve. So that's really where the major problem is that you'll experience. And there you go with all of that. All right, other types of injuries. For the most part, if you're going to break a forearm, you've done this through a fall, or you've done it through really a traumatic impact, or like blunt force trauma kind of thing. The only other one to note, they're not giving me really a good picture of this here. Oh, here we go. So this fracture here, oops. And it doesn't want to give me everything I want, but this fracture here and fracturing your pisiform there is typically done from falling on an extended wrist. So if you like fell down and you had elbow flexion and wrist extension, and you fell on your wrist, that is what would potentially injure either side of the wrist itself. The other thing too that will injure your ulnar side is going to be impact from, like, say, a striking sport, specifically like a hitter in baseball or softball, maybe cricket, or a golfer. You'll see it most often in golf, because if you ground your club, so if I'm a right-handed golfer and I swing and I ground my club, meaning I hit my club into the ground before hitting the ball, I would actually see my left ulnar side of my wrist be vulnerable to injury, because that's where I'm going to have that force dissipating up through the club and into me. Oh, but that's your scaphoid fracture there. The boxer's fracture, I wish they would just show us better views of these, but almost exclusive to your fourth and fifth metacarpal. So if you're punching someone or something, usually those are the ones that are going to get injured. Easiest way to avoid it, other than, not hitting somebody, is instead of punching them, you hammer fist them. So if you want to keep your hands intact, but yet you still want to, have the urge to hit someone or something, hammer fist. All right, we talked about gamekeeper's thumb. If you have an avulsion injury, all that means is that you've had a tendon or ligament injury, but the tendon or ligament isn't affected. It just rips off part of the bone with it. So for the most part, when you have an avulsion injury, the soft tissue is usually okay, but the force behind it essentially rips that straight off the bone, like it rips a piece of the bone off with it, kind of thing. So those are your major injuries there. This here would be potentially an elbow dislocation, but it could also be bursitis. I wouldn't imagine that you'd be holding, like, say, putting any pressure on the elbow if that were truly dislocated. Yeah. This here, the ganglion cyst, that is common to your wrist. A ganglion cyst is a deep cyst. So usually when you talk about, like, say, your Dr. Pimple Popper based cysts, those are superficial. She just goes in, cuts your skin open, rips the cyst sac out, and you're good to go. With a ganglion cyst, it's actually underneath the like a lot of the musculature you have in your wrist. So you actually have to go and get a real surgery to get that removed. They usually aren't something that's dealt with unless they're symptomatic, meaning if they cause you, like, say, pain, or they cause you to have mobility problems. But you have to remove the whole thing or else it would grow back. You can't just say, like, drain something like that. All right, and that is everything there with the wrist and the hand. So what kind of questions do you all have so far on this?
In terms of the injuries, there was just that table. That'd be the best way to look at that.
Yeah, I'm not going to go too in depth on them, but you don't necessarily have to know, like, okay, which sport is going to give me which injury, but I would just know the major ones, like what's the difference between really well, and we'll talk about it too later on down the road, between like a tendonitis, a tendinosis, that kind of thing. But for the most part, as long as you know the differences between, like, say, a tendonitis, a fracture, or other soft tissue injury, that's going to be good enough for now. All right, so that's everything new I have for you there. So thank you all for getting through that up to me. I'll let you all out a few minutes early here, and then I will see you all back here next week.